When Rachel takes a job as a caretaker in a wealthy man's mansion, she expects long shifts and quiet days. But what she finds instead is a portrait of herself hanging on the wall, a portrait that's been there for years. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more moving stories. The wheels of Rachel's sedan crunched along the gravel driveway, the sound sharp in the otherwise eerie silence of the estate. Her eyes widened as she approached the sprawling mansion, its grand stone facade framed by towering oaks that seemed to lean in as if to guard the house's secrets. The building loomed like a sentinel of forgotten wealth, its high arched windows staring down at her like watchful eyes. "Wow," she muttered, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The online job listing hadn't mentioned anything about this. She parked near the entrance, stepping out to get a better look. The mansion's grandeur was almost suffocating. Ivy crawled up one side of the gray stone walls, and the massive front doors, made of polished dark oak, bore an iron knocker in the shape of a lion's head. For a man like Gregory, who had been described as modest and quiet by his social worker, this was an unexpected twist. Rachel adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and rang the doorbell. A soft chime echoed inside the house, like a distant melody played on a grand piano. Her gaze shifted to the side where she spotted a vast garden filled with rose bushes in full bloom. The vibrant red, yellow, and pink petals contrasted sharply with the somber gray of the mansion's walls. After a moment, the door creaked open. A man in a dark gray butler's uniform with crisp white gloves appeared. He had thin, graying hair slicked back neatly and sharp, narrow eyes that assessed her with quiet scrutiny. "Miss Rachel Carter, I presume?" he asked in a tone that carried the weight of tradition and precision. "Yes," Rachel said with a nod, offering a smile. "I'm here for the caretaker position for Mr. Gregory Reed." "Follow me please," he said, stepping aside to allow her entry. The moment she crossed the threshold, Rachel was hit with the scent of polished wood and aged leather. Her sneakers made barely a sound against the gleaming hardwood floors, and she took in her surroundings with wide eyes. The entry hall was bathed in the amber glow of a crystal chandelier, and tapestries hung on either side of the wall, depicting old hunting scenes. A sweeping staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister a smooth, polished mahogany. The butler turned to face her, his hands clasped in front of him. "I am Oliver. If you require assistance or have any questions regarding Mr. Reed's care, you may come to me. Mr. Reed is in the sunroom at the end of the west wing." His eyes lingered on her for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to read her intentions. "Thank you, Oliver," Rachel said, feeling an odd prickle of unease. She followed his directions, her footsteps echoing softly as she passed through the quiet corridors. As she moved further into the mansion, she noticed the decor shifted subtly. The grand opulence of the entrance gave way to something more intimate. Family photos lined the walls, black and white images of children at birthday parties, teenagers posing awkwardly at graduations, and older portraits in sepia. But one particular portrait made her stop. It hung at the end of the corridor, centered as if it were the crown jewel of the hallway. The frame was intricately carved, decorated with floral patterns that seemed to twist and curl like living vines. The painting itself was stunningly detailed, with soft brushstrokes capturing each person with lifelike precision. Her eyes roamed over each face, a man, a woman, two older children, and her breath caught in her chest. There, standing slightly to the side of the woman, was a little girl with wide brown eyes, wild curls, and a gap-toothed smile. Her heart began to race. She took a step closer, squinting to be sure. Her hands pressed against her face, fingers brushing over her cheek as if she could feel it. "That's me," she thought, her eyes locked on the image of the child. "That's me as a little girl." Her mind scrambled for an explanation. The face was unmistakable. The slight dimple in her left cheek, the roundness of her face, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was her. "No," she whispered, backing up slowly as if the painting might leap from the wall. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting Oliver to be behind her, watching her reaction. But she was alone. Her breathing grew faster. "This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make any sense." Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone in her coat pocket. She snapped a photo of the portrait, zooming in on the little girl's face, her own face. Footsteps echoed behind her. Her heart jolted. "Miss Carter?" Oliver's voice was smooth and calm, but it startled her all the same. "Is something wrong?" Rachel spun around, clutching her phone to her chest. Her eyes darted from him to the portrait and back. Her mind screamed at her to play it cool. No, she said, trying to sound casual. "I was just admiring the art. It's a beautiful piece." Indeed, Oliver replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was commissioned many years ago by Mr. Reed. He was particularly fond of this one. Rachel swallowed the question burning in her throat. Instead, she nodded and forced a smile. Well, I'd better get to work. Wouldn't want to keep Mr. Reed waiting. Of course, Oliver said, stepping aside to let her pass. But Rachel felt his eyes on her back as she walked away. Her heart still hammered in her chest as she continued toward the sunroom. What was that? How is it possible? She thought, her mind in a spiral. Was it a coincidence? A mistake? The door to the sunroom was already open. Gregory sat by the window, his frail frame propped up in a large cushioned chair. His silver hair framed his gaunt face, and his eyes were closed as if he'd fallen asleep in the sunlight. Mr. Reed? Rachel said softly as she approached. She gently placed a hand on his arm to rouse him. His eyes fluttered open and he blinked at her, his gaze focusing slowly. Ah, you must be Rachel, he said, his voice soft but kind. You look familiar. Her breath caught at his words. Yes, I'm Rachel Carter, your new caretaker, she replied, masking her unease. Gregory leaned forward, squinting at her face as if trying to recall something. Yes, familiar indeed. You remind me of someone. Someone I knew long ago. His lips curled into a faint smile and he leaned back into his chair. Rachel felt a chill sweep over her arms. Do I? Who do I remind you of? Gregory's gaze drifted toward the window, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he said softly, a girl I once knew, a little girl who lived in a house just like this. She had eyes like yours. Her throat tightened and her fingers curled into her palms. Did she live here? She asked, trying to keep her tone even. But Gregory didn't answer. His breathing suddenly became shallow, his chest rising and falling erratically. Mr. Reed? Rachel leaned forward, her eyes darting to his face. Are you all right? He gripped his chest, his eyes wide with panic. His face contorted in pain, his body jolting forward. Rachel jumped into action, kneeling by his side, pressing 2 fingers to his neck to feel for a pulse. Mr. Reed. Stay with me, she yelled, pushing him back against the chair to open his airway. She began CPR, pressing her hands against his chest, counting each compression. 1, 2, 3, 4. His body remained lifeless. Her breathing quickened and sweat dotted her forehead. Come on, she cried. She tilted his head, pinched his nose and gave 2 rescue breaths. His chest barely rose. No, she thought. She tried again. Compressions. Breath. Compressions. Her arms ached, but she didn't stop. Come on, Gregory, she screamed, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. But his body went still. Her chest heaved with exhaustion as she stopped, her hands hovering over him, desperate to believe he'd breathe on his own. But the silence in the room became unbearable. Rachel slowly lowered her hands, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes welled with tears as she gazed at Gregory's still face. Her pulse pounded in her ears, louder than it had ever been before. Not from the strain of CPR, but from a realization that slowly crept in like a shadow. She was alone in a dead man's house. And she still didn't know why her face was in that painting. Rachel sat frozen on the floor, her hands trembling as she stared at Gregory's lifeless body. The rhythmic ticking of a nearby clock echoed loudly in the silence of the sunroom. The sun, which had once bathed the room in golden warmth, now felt cold and distant. Her fingers twitched as she stared down at her hands. I did everything right, didn't I? I did everything I could. Her mind was a blur of confusion, guilt, and unease. The image of the portrait, the face of her childhood self, floated through her mind. Oh, how is that possible? She thought, her breath shallow. Then came the sound of heavy, hurried footsteps, sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Rachel's heart jumped as she turned toward the sound. A woman appeared in the doorway, dressed in a tailored black coat and pointed heels. Her hair was dark and sleek, pulled into a tight bun that framed her sharp cheekbones. Her eyes, narrow and cold, scanned the scene before her, and when her gaze landed on Rachel kneeling beside Gregory's body, her eyes filled with venom. What have you done?" the woman shrieked, stepping into the room like a storm. Her voice was sharp and filled with rage. Her eyes darted to Gregory's lifeless body and then back to Rachel. He just collapsed," Rachel stammered, pushing herself off the ground. "I tried to help him. I performed CPR, but—" "Don't you dare lie to me," the woman barked, pointing a manicured finger at Rachel. "You're the caretaker, right? The nurse?" Her eyes narrowed into slits. "How convenient that my father dies the moment you show up." Rachel's chest heaved as she raised her hands in a defensive gesture. I swear I didn't do anything. He was talking and then he grabbed his chest. I tried to help him, but I couldn't. Don't lie to me, the woman snapped, her voice rising in pitch. Her nostrils flared as she looked Rachel up and down, eyes filled with disdain. People like you always think you can sneak into wealthy homes and take what doesn't belong to you? Rachel's mouth went dry. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who are you? She asked, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the tremor she felt rising in her throat. The woman stepped forward, her eyes sharp as daggers. I'm Veronica Reed, his daughter. And I'm calling the police. Rachel's stomach twisted. Please, you don't have to do that, she said, panic creeping into her voice. I didn't do anything wrong. Didn't do anything wrong? Veronica hissed, pulling a sleek phone from her coat pocket. Her gaze was locked on Rachel like a predator watching prey. You're a stranger in my father's house. He's dead and you're the only one here. Her eyes narrowed into an icy glare. Don't even think about running. Rachel stepped back, her breath shallow. Her eyes flicked toward the front door, but her feet stayed rooted. Running would make her look guilty. Running would make everything worse. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly, trying to stay calm. Call the police if you have to. I have nothing to hide. Veronica's lips curled into a humorless smile. Good, she said, her eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. She tapped on her phone, her fingers moving with precise efficiency. They'll be here soon. And when they get here, I'll make sure they know exactly who you are. The police arrived in less than 20 minutes. Rachel sat on the front steps of the mansion, her arms wrapped around herself to fend off the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the stone walls of the house, illuminating the scene with pulses of color. Her eyes flickered up as two officers emerged from a squad car, their expressions grim and focused. Detective Roberts was the last to arrive. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a plain gray suit and carried himself with the calm authority of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. His salt and pepper hair was cut short, and his face was marked with subtle creases around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting at lies for too many years. Detective Roberts, homicide, he said as he approached Rachel. His eyes studied her from head to toe, taking in every detail with quiet precision. You must be Rachel Carter? Rachel nodded, her throat dry. Yes, I'm the caretaker. I just started today. Caretaker, huh? He tilted his head, glancing toward the house where paramedics were rolling out a stretcher with Gregory's covered body on top. His eyes lingered on the site for a moment longer than necessary. Then his gaze snapped back to Rachel. Funny timing, don't you think? First day on the job and your client drops dead. Her breath hitched, but she fought to keep her voice steady. It's not like that, detective. He had a heart attack. I did everything I could to save him. Roberts raised a skeptical brow. Heart attack, huh? How do you know it was a heart attack? Are you a doctor? I'm a nurse, she replied. I've seen this happen before. He raised his eyebrows, unimpressed. Convenient? Rachel stiffened. I know what it looks like, but I didn't hurt him. Roberts tilted his head, eyes sharp as he watched her closely. You're right about one thing. It does look bad. Real bad. Detective, Veronica's voice rang out as she marched up the steps, her heels clicking like gunfire. This woman was alone with my father when he died. She's the only person who could have done it. Her eyes cut toward Rachel, full of loathing. She had everything to gain from his death. That's not true. Rachel protested, turning to face them both. I didn't even know about his money or this mansion or anything until I got here today. I'm just a nurse. Just a nurse, Veronica sneered. How quaint. Roberts raised a hand to silence them both. All right, that's enough. He looked at Rachel, eyes narrowing like a hawk locking onto prey. We'll continue this at the station. Miss Carter, you're coming with me? Rachel felt the words hit her like a punch to the chest. Am I under arrest? Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. Not yet. But you're a person of interest? That's close enough. At the police station, Rachel sat in a cold, windowless interrogation room. The single overhead light buzzed faintly, and the metal chair beneath her felt as unforgiving as stone. She rubbed her arms, trying to ward off the chill. Detective Roberts sat across from her, leaning forward, his hands folded on the table like he had all the time in the world. Tell me everything that happened from the moment you arrived, he said calmly, but his eyes stayed sharp. Rachel recounted everything, arriving at the mansion, meeting Oliver the butler, exploring the hallway and finding that portrait. She hesitated for a moment but decided to tell him about it. The painting, she said, her voice low but firm. It had a girl in it. A girl who looked like me. Roberts leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You saw yourself in a painting? That's what you're going with? I'm not imagining it, she insisted. It was me. Sure it was, Roberts said with a shrug, leaning back. Look, I'm gonna be real with you, Rachel. I've seen cases like this before. Caretaker gets a little too close, sees an opportunity, and decides to make a play for the money. No, Rachel snapped, leaning forward. I'm not like that. Roberts tilted his head. If I put you in front of a judge and jury, you think they'll believe that? He let the question hang in the air. Tears pricked Rachel's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She glared at him, unflinching. I don't care if they believe me. I know the truth. Roberts leaned back, his eyes studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. We'll see. He stood and knocked on the door. It opened with a soft click. Get comfortable, Rachel. You might be here a while. As the door closed, Rachel felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The portrait, Gregory's death, Veronica's accusations. It all swirled around her like a storm she couldn't escape. Alone in that cold room, Rachel whispered to herself, I'll find out the truth, no matter what it takes. Rachel's footsteps echoed against the cold, tile floor of the police station. Her heart pounded with a mixture of relief and dread. She was free, but only barely. The lack of evidence felt more like a warning than a victory. Detective Roberts had made it clear that she wasn't off the hook. Don't go too far, he had said as she signed the release paperwork. His eyes lingered on her like she was a ticking bomb he was waiting to go off. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she stepped outside. The cool night air hit her like a slap to the face. The flashing red and blue lights from a squad car made her feel like the whole world was watching her. She glanced around, half expecting to see cameras pointed at her, but no one was there. No flashing bulbs. No paparazzi. Just her, the night, and the quiet hum of distant traffic. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. With a sigh, she pulled it out. It was a text from her coworker Sarah. Hey, I just heard. Call me when you're home. People are talking. Rachel's fingers hovered over the screen. Her heart sank. Talking? She didn't have to ask what they were talking about. Her coworkers must have heard about the interrogation. Veronica's accusations had probably spread faster than wildfire. Rachel typed a quick reply. I'm fine. I'll call later. She shoved the phone into her coat pocket and started walking. She didn't want to call a rideshare or a cab. She needed to clear her head, to walk off the weight of everything she'd just been through. Her eyes darted around the empty street, every shadow seeming sharper than usual. Her nerves were on edge. By the time she made it home, her legs ached. Her tiny apartment on West Laurel Avenue was dim and quiet. The kitchen light flickered once, a reminder she still needed to get the landlord to fix it. She dropped her bag by the door and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. Her muscles felt like steel cords stretched too tight. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an alert. She glanced at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Local nurse suspected in wealthy man's mysterious death. Her heart stopped. It was a news article. Her fingers moved before her brain could catch up, tapping the notification. The link opened to a local news website. Her face was there, her mugshot, plastered on the screen next to a headline that may as well have been a death sentence. Murder or misfortune? Caretaker accused of elderly man's sudden death. Her mouth went dry. No, 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 she muttered, scrolling through the article. They had everything, her name, her occupation, her connection to Gregory Reed. The whole story had been spun just the way Veronica wanted. They called her a person of interest and quoted Veronica, who claimed Rachel was the only person alone with Gregory at the time of his death. Her breath came in short bursts. Her eyes darted to the comments section below the article. Don't look. Don't look. But she couldn't stop herself. Another gold digger thinking she could get rich quick? How do these people get hired in the first place? Fire her. I wouldn't want her near my parents. Rachel threw her phone onto the couch, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She buried her face in her hands, pressing her fingers against her scalp. How did this happen so fast? A knock came at the door. She jumped. Her heart raced. She wiped her face and glanced through the peephole. It was her landlord, Mr. Avery. Rachel hesitated but finally unlocked the door. Hey, Mr. Avery. He stood there, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes darting to the hallway like he was afraid of being seen with her. His usual warm demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold, professional tone. Rachel, I hate to do this, but... He scratched the back of his neck. I've been getting calls from some of the other tenants. Concerned? Concerned? She repeated, eyebrows drawing together. Yeah, he muttered. People are saying things, Rachel. You know how it is. Her eyes burned with disbelief. You're not serious. He sighed deeply, his eyes not meeting hers. Just try to keep it quiet, all right? I don't want to have to. He trailed off, looking away. I'm just giving you a heads up. Rachel's hands clenched into fists. I'm not a criminal, Mr. Avery. You know me. I've lived here for 3 years. I know, he said quickly, raising his hands. I'm just saying. People talk. She slammed the door before he could say anything else. Her chest heaved with frustration. People talk. The next day things got worse. Her phone buzzed as she was pouring herself a cup of coffee. It was her supervisor, Evelyn Duval, from the hospital. Rachel hesitated but picked up. Hello? Rachel, it's Evelyn. Her supervisor's cool, clipped voice came through the line. We need to talk. Her stomach tightened. Okay. Effective immediately, you're suspended from duty until further notice. Rachel's eyes widened and she set her coffee down with a sharp clatter. What? Suspended? Why? There's been concern, Evelyn said with a pause, and Rachel could hear her carefully choosing her words. Given the ongoing investigation, we feel it's best to put you on leave until things are cleared up. But I didn't do anything, Rachel said, her voice shaking. You know me, Evelyn. I've worked there for 5 years. You know I'd never. It's not about what I believe, Evelyn cut in. It's about perception. Patients' families are asking questions. We have to consider our reputation. Your reputation? Rachel echoed, stunned. What about my reputation? Silence. Take care, Rachel, Evelyn said softly. The line went dead. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. It's happening. Her job. Her home. Her name. It was all slipping away faster than she could stop it. 4 hours she stayed at the kitchen table, her mind numb with disbelief. But as the sun began to set, she felt a shift, a spark of clarity. Her eyes narrowed, her mind laser-focused on one image, that portrait. Her younger face. Her childhood face. Her face in Gregory Reed's house. Her breath became steady. Her heart stopped racing. She clenched her jaw and stood up slowly, like a soldier ready for war. No more waiting. No more hoping it all blows over. If she didn't figure out who she was in that portrait, and why her face was there, she'd never be free of the suspicion hanging over her. It wasn't just about proving she hadn't killed Gregory. It was about finding out who she really was. Later that night, Rachel stood at the edge of the mansion's vast front lawn. The grand stone house loomed before her, its windows like dark eyes watching her approach. Her breath fogged in front of her as she exhaled slowly, her resolve set. She pulled the hood of her coat over her head and checked for lights. There were none. Veronica had probably gone back to wherever she lived, no doubt drinking wine and bragging to her friends about getting Rachel fired. Rachel's jaw tightened as she slipped around to the side of the mansion. Her heart pounded as she moved quietly along the ivy-covered wall. She spotted the kitchen window unlocked. Her fingers curled around the frame. With one push it slid open. She climbed inside, landing softly on the kitchen floor. Her breath was shallow, but her heart was steady. She knew exactly where she was going this time. The hallway with the portrait. Her footsteps were silent on the hardwood. The shadows stretched long and sharp. Every creak in the house made her pause, but no footsteps followed her. She reached the hallway and there it was, the portrait. Her breath hitched as her eyes locked on the image of the little girl. Her face. Her heart raced, her mind filling with questions. How is this possible? Her eyes flicked to the bottom of the portrait, to the tiny gold plate attached to the frame. Her eyes narrowed as she read the name. Gregory Reed and Family, 1995. Her gaze shot back to the little girl. That doesn't make sense. I didn't know him in 1995. Her fingers hovered over the nameplate and with a sharp pull, she yanked it loose. Beneath it there was something scratched into the wood. It was faint but visible under the dim light. The truth lies beneath the roses. Her breath caught in her chest. The roses. The garden of roses. Her heart thudded with certainty. There's something buried out there. And she was going to find it. The mansion loomed ahead like a giant beast watching Rachel's every move. Shadows stretched long and sharp against the ground, the moonlight offering just enough glow to see but not be seen. Her heart pounded harder with every step she took toward the estate. The cold autumn air stung her face but she barely noticed. Her eyes stayed locked on her target. Her breath came out in short, foggy puffs. Her footsteps were light, calculated, each one deliberate. She was no longer thinking like a nurse, a caretaker, or a person trying to clear her name. She was thinking like someone on a mission. Get in. Find the truth. Get out. Her eyes scanned the windows as she crept alongside the side wall of the house. No lights on. No signs of movement. No shadows flickering across the glass. Still, her nerves buzzed like live wires. She crouched low, glancing back toward the street. Her car was parked 3 blocks away, out of sight. If anyone spotted her, she'd have to run for it. Rachel reached the kitchen window. She knew this entry point well from earlier. It slid open with a quiet push, just as it had before. She hoisted herself up, heart thumping in her chest, and climbed in. Her sneakers hit the floor with barely a sound. The house was deathly quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, the familiar shape of the kitchen cabinets, the steel sink, the table in the corner. She didn't linger. Every second she stayed here was a second closer to being caught. Go. Move. Don't stop. She moved like a shadow through the hallways, sticking close to the walls. Her breaths were shallow, measured, barely a sound. The long hallway felt even longer in the dark, each creak of the floorboards threatening to betray her presence. But she knew exactly where she was going this time. The study. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open. The scent of old paper, leather-bound books, and faint traces of pipe tobacco greeted her. Her eyes darted around the room. Bookshelves lined 2 walls from floor to ceiling, while an ornate wooden desk sat at the center, its surface cluttered with papers and trinkets. Start there. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying softness. Her eyes scanned the desk as she approached. It was more organized than she had expected, everything placed neatly in files or small stacks. She carefully pulled open the top drawer. Empty except for some pens and loose paper clips. She moved to the second drawer. Files. She rifled through them, her heart quickening as she scanned each label. Bank statements. Property deeds. Birth certificates. Her fingers hovered over that last folder. Birth certificates? She pulled it out, her breath catching. Inside were certificates for Gregory's children, Curtis and Veronica Reed. Both listed Gregory Reed as the father. She flipped the pages, her pulse quickening. She was searching for one more. Come on, come on, come on. But there was nothing else. Her chest tightened with frustration. She shoved the folder back into the drawer, her fingers shaking as she moved to the bottom drawer. Locked. Of course. She cursed under her breath, glancing around the room for something to pry it open. Her eyes landed on a brass letter opener sitting on the desk. It was long and sharp at the tip. Perfect. Rachel snatched it up and shoved the tip into the drawer's keyhole. Her hands moved with more confidence than she expected. A wiggle here. A twist there. The lock popped with a soft click. She yanked the drawer open. Inside were notebooks, a stack of envelopes, and a small leather-bound journal. Her fingers hovered over the journal, something about it calling to her. She picked it up, flipping through it quickly. Dates, addresses, and small scribbles filled the pages, but one page caught her attention. Scrawled in Gregory's rough, uneven handwriting were 6 words. The truth lies beneath the roses. Her breath hitched. Her eyes darted toward the window, remembering the vibrant rose garden she'd seen on her first day here. She could see it in her mind now, sprawling bushes of red, pink, and white roses, their petals practically glowing in the sunlight. Her pulse quickened. Beneath the roses. She didn't have to guess what that meant. Her fingers gripped the edge of the journal for a moment before she shoved it into her coat pocket. Time to go. Rachel stepped out the back door and into the cold night air. The grass crunched softly beneath her sneakers as she made her way toward the rose garden. She kept low, her eyes darting to every window of the mansion, checking for movement. Her breath came in short puffs, every exhale fogging the air like tiny clouds. The roses were even larger than she remembered. Their petals glowed faintly in the moonlight, their thorny stems weaving into a thick, wild maze. Her eyes scanned each bush. Which one? She moved to the largest bush, its red roses as vivid as blood. Her fingers dug into the soil beneath it. The dirt was cold, hard-packed from years of rain and growth. Her hands ached as she clawed at it, dirt caking under her nails. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her breath came in hard, uneven gasps as she dug deeper. The soil gave way slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to reveal its secrets. Her fingers scraped something solid, something hard. Metal. Her eyes widened, her heart racing as she clawed more dirt away. Her nails scratched the surface of a rusted box about the size of a shoebox. She pulled it out, brushing away the dirt with quick, frantic movements. The box had a small latch on the front, rusted shut from years of weather exposure. Her fingers gripped the edge of it and tugged, gritting her teeth as she yanked it open. The latch broke with a snap and the lid creaked upward. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside were old photographs, folded papers, and brittle letters bound with twine. Her hands hovered over the contents, her fingers trembling as she lifted a photo from the pile. It was a picture of Gregory. Younger, stronger. He was smiling, holding a baby in his arms. Her heart stopped. Her fingers trembled as she brought the photo closer. The baby had chubby cheeks, wide eyes, and thick curls of hair that framed her small face. Rachel knew that face. It wasn't just similar, it was her face. Her breath hitched, her heart hammering in her chest. No, it's not possible. But it was. Her mind rebelled, but the evidence was in her hands. That's me. That baby is me. Her eyes darted to the other papers. She untied the twine, flipping through them with frantic urgency. Medical records. Letters signed by Gregory. And finally, her breath hitched. A birth certificate. Her birth certificate. Her eyes darted down to the name under father. Father, Gregory Reed. Her chest tightened so hard she thought she might break. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart thundering in her ears. Her knees hit the dirt, the weight of it all crashing into her like a tidal wave. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No. This has to be wrong. She flipped through more documents, tears stinging her eyes. Every letter, every note, every official document confirmed it. Her mind spun, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. Her whole world had just shifted. Gregory Reed is my father. Her fingers pressed against her temples as her breathing grew ragged. Everything she'd ever known about her life felt like a lie. The world tilted. Her vision blurred. But one thought cut through the fog like a razor. Veronica knew. Curtis knew. They knew who I was. Her lips pressed into a firm line, her eyes hard as stone. This wasn't just about money or an inheritance. They had kept this from her. Hidden her identity. Her hands clenched into fists, dirt crumbling between her fingers. Her gaze turned toward the mansion, the windows dark and still. Her mind was no longer foggy with fear. They knew who I was and they didn't want me to find out. But it was too late for them now. She had the truth. And she wasn't letting it go. Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing the dirt-stained jeans and hoodie she'd worn the night before. Her fingers tapped against the metal box on her lap, the coolness of the metal seeping through the fabric of her sweatpants. The soft hum of the morning city buzzed outside her window, but it felt distant, like a faint echo from another world. Her gaze stayed locked on the photograph in her hands. Gregory Reed. Young, vibrant, and smiling like a man without a care in the world. In his arms, he cradled a baby with a chubby face, curly hair, and wide, curious eyes. Her breathing slowed as she studied every detail of the photo. The way he held the baby wasn't distant or awkward, it was close, protective, loving. He knew. He knew I was his daughter, she thought, swallowing a lump in her throat. Her fingers hovered over his face as if she could touch him through the image. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Her mother had never mentioned Gregory. Not once. Not in passing. Not in anger. Why didn't she tell me? Rachel leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing as memories of her childhood came rushing back. Her mother was always busy. Working late shifts. Tired eyes. Short-tempered when Rachel asked too many questions. There were nights when Rachel had wondered why she didn't have a dad like other kids at school, but every time she brought it up, her mother would deflect or change the subject. Your dad isn't someone we talk about, Rachel, her mother had once said, her voice firm but her eyes distant. Rachel remembered that day vividly. She had been 10, sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. Her mom was folding clothes and Rachel had asked, "Do I look like him?" Her mother had paused for just a moment, the crease in her brow deepening. "No," she'd said too quickly. "You look like me." Then she turned away, her hands moving faster over the fabric she folded. She knew. She knew the whole time. Rachel's fingers tightened on the photograph until the edge bent slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered to the empty room. Her gaze shifted to the documents spread across her bed. Letters signed by Gregory. Birth records with his name listed as father. Medical records. His handwriting was neat but distinct, each letter deliberate, like he knew every word counted. Some of the letters were addressed to her mother. Others were never sent. Her breath caught as she read one of the unsent letters. "I want to see her, Mara. Please. Just once. She deserves to know. I'll keep my distance if that's what you want, but she has a right to know who I am." Her heart ached as she read it again and again. He tried to reach out. Her mother had kept it from her. What? Rachel's jaw clenched with quiet anger. But her sadness quickly turned into focus. This isn't just about the past. This is about now. She glanced at the clock on the wall. If she brought these documents to the police, she could establish her right to Gregory's estate. She could prove she wasn't some opportunistic caretaker like Veronica claimed. She could clear her name. Her eyes flickered back to the photo of Gregory and baby Rachel. You owe me an explanation, Gregory. And if you can't give it to me, I'll take it from the people who can. Rachel stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing her hands clean of dirt. The cold water chilled her fingers, but she didn't care. Her eyes stayed focused on the small pile of documents she had wrapped in plastic to keep them safe. Her plan was simple: get these files to the police. Present them as proof of her connection to Gregory. And end this nightmare. She glanced over her shoulder at the window. The sun was climbing higher now, bathing the garden outside in warm light. The rose garden. She felt a chill crawl down her spine. Her heart pounded as the memory of the dirt beneath her nails came rushing back. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She wiped her hands on a towel and checked the screen. It wasn't a message. It was a security alert. Her smart doorbell camera had picked up movement. Her blood ran cold. The live feed showed 3 men standing at the front of the mansion. 2 of them she didn't recognize, burly men wearing black jackets, but she knew the third one. Curtis Reed. Tall, broad, and sharp-eyed, with that same cold stare his sister Veronica had. Her heart jumped into her throat. What are they doing here? Her fingers hovered over her phone. Call the police. But then her mind raced. If she called the police, Curtis would claim she had broken in. She'd be arrested again, and this time they'd have leverage. They'd call her an intruder trespassing on family property. Think, Rachel. Think fast. Her eyes darted to the kitchen drawer. She reached for the knife. Curtis Reed's voice echoed across the garden as he stepped through the side gate, his footsteps crunching the gravel path. Rachel, he called out, his voice casual, almost playful. Rachel, you out here? You and I need to have a little chat. Rachel's breath hitched. She crouched low, hiding behind one of the larger rose bushes. She clutched the metal box against her chest, heart racing. She bit her bottom lip to keep from breathing too loudly. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Curtis called again, his tone darker now. You know you're not supposed to be here. And you definitely know you're not supposed to be snooping around. He took a step closer. But you already knew that, didn't you? Her fingers gripped the edge of the metal box tighter. Her mind spun with options, but every one of them felt like a dead end. She glanced at the back fence, measuring the distance. If she ran, he'd see her. If she stayed, he'd find her. I have to bluff. She stood slowly, her heart thudding in her ears. Curtis, she said, her voice steady despite the fear burning in her chest. She stepped out from behind the bush, keeping the metal box at her side. What are you doing here? Curtis's eyes locked on her instantly, his smirk sharp as a blade. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. I should be asking you that, don't you think? His gaze dropped to her hands, eyes narrowing on the dirt under her nails. Looks like you've been digging. Rachel swallowed, trying to stay calm. I was just paying respects, she said, her voice low but steady. Gregory's gone. Someone has to tend to the garden. Curtis tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he took another step forward. That so? He glanced toward his 2 companions, who now flanked him on either side like wolves circling prey. Funny thing about you, Rachel. You keep showing up where you're not supposed to. I'm not doing anything wrong, she said, her eyes darting to the back gate. It was at least 30 feet away. Too far. See, that's where you're wrong, Curtis replied, taking another slow step forward. His eyes flicked to her hands, then her coat pocket. He knows. Whatever you think you found, he said, his voice low and full of warning, it doesn't belong to you. You're playing with things you don't understand. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. I'm not playing, Curtis. Not anymore. His smirk disappeared. Stay out of family business, he said, his eyes dark with warning. This isn't a fight you want. Rachel didn't back down. Maybe I'm family, Curtis? His eyes flashed with something sharp and deadly, and for a moment she saw it, fear. She stepped back, her gaze locked on his. You're right, Curtis. I don't want this fight. But I'm not running. His face hardened. You will? Without another word, Rachel spun on her heel and ran. She didn't look back, didn't wait to hear them shout. Her legs pumped as she sprinted toward the side gate. Her breath burned in her lungs, her eyes locked on the only exit. Get her. Curtis roared behind her. But Rachel was already gone. She burst through the side gate, her feet hitting the pavement. She didn't stop running. She didn't slow down. Her chest heaved as she reached the end of the block, heart pounding, eyes sharp with one thought on her mind. They're afraid of me now. Rachel sat at the small booth in the corner of Joe's diner, tapping her fingers on the worn formica table. Her eyes darted to the window every few seconds, scanning the street for any sign of Marcus. She'd never met him before today, but his reputation had come highly recommended by an old friend from the hospital. The small metal box sat on the bench next to her, wrapped in a black hoodie to keep it out of sight. Every now and then, her eyes flickered toward it, her mind replaying the events of the last 24 hours. The photograph of Gregory cradling a baby, was burned into her memory like a brand. Her heart thudded with a mix of anxiety and resolve. The bell above the diner's entrance jingled. Rachel's head shot up. A man stepped inside, scanning the room with sharp, hawk-like eyes. He was in his late 40s, with a salt and pepper beard and a leather jacket that looked like it had seen its fair share of rough days. His gaze settled on Rachel, and he approached her booth with slow, deliberate steps. "Rachel Carter?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Marcus," she replied, sitting up straighter. "That's me," he confirmed, sliding into the booth across from her. His eyes moved to the hoodie beside her, his brow lifting slightly. "That the package?" Rachel nodded, pulling it onto the table. She unwrapped the hoodie, revealing the metal box. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he inspected it. "Did you look inside?" he asked. "I did," she replied, her voice steady but tense. "Birth certificate, letters, photos. Proof that Gregory Reed was my father." He glanced up at her, his eyes assessing. "Mind if I see for myself?" Rachel hesitated for only a second before opening the box. The metallic creak of the hinges echoed in the quiet diner. She pulled out the papers and photographs, laying them out on the table. Marcus leaned in, his eyes scanning each document with the precision of a man who had seen a lot of lies and could smell the truth. His fingers moved across the birth certificate, his brow furrowed as he studied the official seals, the signatures, the dates. "Legit," he muttered, nodding. He picked up one of the letters addressed to Rachel's mother, his eyes moving quickly as he read it. "He knew about you," he said quietly, flicking the letter with his finger. "Looks like he tried to reach out more than once." She kept him at arm's length. "Yeah," Rachel replied, her gaze distant. "My mom never told me anything about him." "Not a word." Marcus exhaled, leaning back in the booth, his eyes sharp but calm. "This changes everything, does it?" Rachel asked, her eyes locked on his. "Veronica and Curtis will do everything they can to bury this. They'll claim I faked it." Marcus tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in thought. "They'll try. But if these records are as legit as they look, they've got a problem. Blood is blood, Rachel. Courts like that kind of thing?" "Yeah, well, blood doesn't mean much when you have money and power," Rachel said bitterly. "Veronica's already spreading rumors about me. People think I'm a criminal." Marcus gave her a long, thoughtful look. "You want my advice?" Rachel nodded. "File a claim to the estate. Do it fast before they lock it down." Her brows knitted. "What do you mean, lock it down?" "They're probably already talking to their lawyers," Marcus explained, his eyes cold and pragmatic. "They'll try to freeze Gregory's assets, keep you from touching any part of the estate. If they do that, you'll be tied up in court for months, maybe years." Rachel leaned forward, her jaw tight. "Then I'll file. Today." "Good," Marcus said, pulling out a small notepad and scribbling something down. "I know a guy who can help. He's a probate lawyer, not flashy, but he knows how to move fast." "Thank you," Rachel said, relief flickering in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt like she had a path forward. 2 days later, Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Call me. Urgent." Her heart lurched. She stepped away from the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and called him. "Marcus?" she said the second he picked up. "Bad news," Marcus replied. His voice was sharp, serious. "Curtis and Veronica just filed a petition to freeze the inheritance." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "They did what?" "They're claiming you're a fraud," he said bluntly. "They're saying the birth certificate is fake and that you've been manipulating Gregory for money. You've been listed as a person of interest in their formal complaint." Her head throbbed with a sudden rush of rage and disbelief. "They can't do that. I have proof, real proof. The letters, the photo." "They don't care, Rachel," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "All they have to do is create doubt. The court will freeze the funds until it's sorted. And they have the advantage of being his official heirs." Rachel pressed her hand against her forehead, squeezing her eyes shut. Her mind raced. What do I do? Get ready to fight, Marcus replied. I'll file a counterclaim, but it's gonna get ugly. That night, Rachel sat on the couch, staring at the metal box on her coffee table. Her apartment was dark except for the glow of a single lamp. Her eyes darted to the front door for the 5th time. Her nerves were on edge. Curtis will come. He always does. Her heart skipped when she heard a faint noise. A click. Her body went rigid. The sound came again. The knob on her front door jiggled once. Twice. Her blood went cold. Her phone was on the kitchen counter 10 feet away. Too far. She reached for the knife she'd left next to the metal box, her fingers wrapping around the handle. Her eyes locked on the door. The jiggling stopped. Silence. Then, crack. The door frame splintered as the lock gave way. The door flew open and Curtis Reed stepped inside like a predator entering his den. Evening, Rachel, Curtis said, his voice slick with false charm. He glanced at the door frame, grinning. Oops. Guess I forgot my key. Her breath came in sharp bursts, but she didn't move. Her fingers gripped the knife tighter, hiding it behind her leg. What do you want, Curtis? She asked, her voice low, steady. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze settling on the metal box. You know why I'm here, Rachel? Her eyes stayed locked on him. You're wasting your time. You'll never get it. He chuckled, his eyes full of quiet malice. I think I will. He lunged. Rachel moved on instinct. She swung the knife upward and Curtis jerked back, narrowly avoiding the blade. She darted toward the kitchen, her hand grabbing her phone. Her fingers moved fast, hitting Marcus on speed dial. Pick up, pick up, pick up, she muttered under her breath as she spun to face Curtis, knife in one hand, phone in the other. Put it down, Rachel, Curtis said, his eyes narrowing like a wolf circling prey. You don't want this to get worse. The line clicked. Marcus's voice came through. Rachel? He's here, she yelled. Curtis is in my apartment. Stay on the line, Marcus said, his voice sharp with urgency. I'm calling the police. Curtis's face twisted with fury. You shouldn't have done that. He moved toward her, but Rachel didn't back down. I'm not afraid of you, Curtis, she yelled, raising the knife. For a moment they locked eyes. She could see it. Doubt. He didn't expect her to fight back. Cops are on their way, she growled, her chest heaving with adrenaline. Run. He sneered at her, his jaw tight. This isn't over. He turned, darting out the door. She heard his footsteps pounding down the stairs. Rachel gripped the counter for support, her breath shallow and shaky. Rachel? Marcus's voice came through the phone. You okay? Her eyes hardened as she stared at the broken doorframe. No, she said, her voice cold with resolve. But I will beat. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, fingers drumming anxiously as Marcus flipped through the pages of Gregory's old letters and financial records. The soft glow of the kitchen light illuminated his face, his brow furrowed with sharp focus. Every so often he'd pause, tilt his head, and let out a low hum of realization before jotting something down in his notepad. Rachel watched him, her stomach twisting in knots. Tell me something good, Marcus, she said, her voice low but urgent. Tell me I have more than just some old letters and a birth certificate. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed locked on the pages before him, his pen tapping against the table. Then, with a slow breath, he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Well, he said, crossing his arms, you've got more than you think. Rachel straightened. What do you mean? He picked up a letter, tapping it against the table. This right here is proof of Gregory's relationship with your mom. No doubt about it. He was writing to her for years. Look at the dates. It goes all the way back to 1992. He flipped to another letter. See this one? He mentions you by name. He knew you were his kid. Her throat tightened as she stared at the letter. Her fingers hovered just over it, afraid to touch it, as if it might crumble beneath her fingertips. She blinked quickly, forcing down the sting in her eyes. So why didn't he ever come for me? She muttered. If he knew, why didn't he come find me? Marcus tilted his head, his gaze softening just a bit. Maybe he tried. Your mom might have shut him out. Her jaw tensed. Might have. No, she knew the truth. Her mother had shut him out. The letters had made that clear. Marcus tapped his pen against the next set of documents. That's the personal stuff, he said, flipping to the next section. But this is where it gets interesting. He pulled out copies of Gregory's financial statements. Rachel leaned in, her eyes scanning the lines of numbers she didn't fully understand. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing at a particular entry from 3 years ago. This is a withdrawal for $250,000 from one of Gregory's accounts. Then look here. He flipped to a different sheet. A transfer of the exact same amount, made on the same day, to a holding company called Fairmill Ventures. So? Rachel asked, frowning. So, Fairmill Ventures doesn't exist, Marcus said, his eyes sharp. It's a shell. It doesn't have a listed office, no employees, no tax records. And guess who's listed as a consultant on the account? Rachel leaned forward. Who? Curtis Reed, Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. Veronica too. Both of them are tied to this account. Her heart thudded in her chest. So they were stealing from him? Bingo, Marcus said, dropping the papers on the table. They set up a shell company and siphoned money out of Gregory's personal accounts. Classic embezzlement scheme. Rachel leaned back, her mind reeling. Her heart pounded with a mix of anger and adrenaline. They're calling me a fraud while they've been robbing him blind, she said, her voice tight with disbelief. Exactly, Marcus said, eyes locked on hers. They're scrambling. You being here, being his daughter, it ruins everything. They can't risk you getting a piece of that inheritance. Her lips pressed into a firm line. I'm not backing down. Good, Marcus said, standing. But you need to be ready. They know you're not going away, which means they're gonna come at you harder. Let them, Rachel muttered, her eyes locked on the documents. They already tried once. I'll be ready next time. 2 days later, Rachel's phone buzzed on her kitchen counter. She was in the living room folding clothes, her thoughts distant. When she saw the name flash on her screen, her jaw tightened. Curtis Reed. Her eyes narrowed, her fingers hovering over the phone. Part of her wanted to let it go to voicemail. Don't give him the satisfaction. But something in her gut told her to answer. She tapped the green button and held the phone to her ear. What do you want, Curtis? Nice to hear your voice too, sis, Curtis replied, his tone slick and mocking. Thought you'd appreciate a little family reunion? Her fingers curled into fists. We're not family, Curtis. He let out a low chuckle. Says the girl playing dress up with daddy's old toys? His voice dropped lower, darker. Listen to me, Rachel. I'm only gonna say this once. Drop the case. Walk away. Not happening, she snapped. There was a pause, followed by a slow, deliberate sigh. I was hoping you'd be smarter than this, Curtis muttered. His voice had a dangerous calm now, like a predator about to pounce. You think you can fight me? You think you can beat us? You have no idea what you're up against? Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm not afraid of you, Curtis. You will be, he replied. See you soon, Rachel. The line went dead. Her grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. Her breath came faster. Her eyes flicked to the door, then to the windows. Stay calm. Stay in control. Her fingers quickly tapped Marcus's number. Later that night, Rachel sat in her living room, the TV playing quietly in the background. Her eyes flicked to the front door every few minutes. Marcus had promised to send a patrol car to watch her building, but she still felt like a target with a bullseye on her back. Her heart jumped at the faint thump outside her window. Her eyes locked on the shadow moving near the fire escape. Her breath caught in her throat. Not again. Her phone was in her hand in seconds. She dialed Marcus. It's happening, she whispered into the phone, her eyes still on the window. Fire escape. Someone's out there. Stay on the line, Marcus's voice was sharp. Don't move. She slipped off the couch, crouching low behind the kitchen counter, her eyes locked on the window. Her breath was slow, deliberate. Her heart hammered in her ears. Tap, tap, tap. The window latch jiggled. Her heart leapt into her throat. Her fingers curled around the kitchen knife she'd left on the counter earlier. Her grip was tight, her breath shallow. The latch unlocked. The window slid open, slow and deliberate. A dark figure climbed through, tall, broad shoulders, wearing a hoodie and gloves. Rachel didn't think. She moved on instinct. H.E.A., she yelled, rising from behind the counter, brandishing the knife. The figure froze, startled, his head whipping toward her. For a brief moment, his face was visible. It wasn't Curtis. It was someone else. One of Curtis's friends? Wrong house, buddy. Rachel yelled, her voice sharper than she thought possible. She took a step toward him, brandishing the knife like she'd done it 1,000 times before. The man took a step back, his eyes darting to the open window. But before he could make a move, there was a loud bang from the front door. Freeze, a voice shouted. Heavy footsteps stormed in, and the man spun around, eyes wide with panic. Detective Roberts and Marcus rushed in, guns drawn. Hands up. Hands where I can see him. Roberts barked. The man's hands shot into the air. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Rachel's shoulders sagged with relief, the knife falling from her hand onto the counter. Her breaths came fast and shallow as her heart finally started to slow. Marcus strode toward her, his eyes sharp with concern. "You all right?" he asked, gripping her shoulder. Rachel nodded, her breath shaky but steady. Her eyes stayed locked on the man in handcuffs. She stepped forward, her gaze colder than ever. "Tell Curtis," she said, her voice low but firm, "that next time I won't be waiting with a knife. I'll be waiting with the cops." The man lowered his eyes, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Marcus glanced at her, his lips curling into a grin. "Remind me not to mess with you, Rachel." Her eyes flicked to him, her face hard as steel. "Damn right." Rachel's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She snatched it up, eyes narrowing at the name flashing across the screen, Marcus. Her heart instantly quickened. Calls from Marcus rarely meant good news. She swiped to answer. "What's wrong?" "Veronica's running," Marcus's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "We just got a tip. She booked a last-minute flight out of the country. She's at the airport now." Rachel's heart stopped for a second, then kicked into overdrive. "What? How long do we have?" "Not long," Marcus replied, the sound of tires screeching in the background. "Her flight leaves in 30. Roberts is en route. I'm picking you up. Be outside in 5. "On it," Rachel said, already grabbing her jacket and throwing it on. She shoved the metal box of evidence into her backpack and zipped it tight. Her sneakers hit the floor in hurried thuds as she dashed for the door. The ride to the airport was a blur of flashing streetlights and sharp turns. Marcus's car swerved through traffic like a shark cutting through water. Rachel gripped the seatbelt across her chest, her jaw tight as her eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. 22 minutes, Marcus muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "If she gets past security, it's over. They won't stop a passenger boarding unless we have an arrest warrant in hand. Then we catch her before she gets there," Rachel said, her voice hard as steel. Marcus glanced at her from the corner of his eye, his lips curling into a small grin. "I like the way you think." They pulled into the airport's main terminal, tires screeching to a halt near the entrance. Rachel barely waited for the car to stop before she jumped out, her eyes scanning the crowd of travelers and wheeled luggage. "Gate C19, Marcus said, jogging up beside her. "That's her flight to the Bahamas. Roberts is already inside." Rachel's heart thudded in her chest as they pushed through the entrance, the sharp, sterile air of the airport hitting her like a wall. The crowd of travelers surged in every direction. Parents wrangling kids, flight attendants dragging luggage, businessmen glued to their phones. Her eyes darted everywhere, searching for Veronica's sleek, perfect frame. "She'll be heading for security," Marcus said, his eyes scanning just as quickly. "Her only chance is to get through before we catch up." Rachel's gaze snapped toward the security checkpoint, where a slow-moving line of passengers snaked toward TSA officers. She spotted Detective Roberts standing at the entrance, his eyes locked on something deeper in the line. "There," she hissed, grabbing Marcus's arm and yanking him toward it. "Roberts sees her." As they approached, Roberts raised a hand in signal. Far end of the line. Black coat. Big sunglasses. "It's her?" Rachel's eyes darted to the end of the line and locked on the figure. Veronica. Her sleek black trench coat hugged her frame, and her dark glasses covered most of her face, but there was no mistaking her. The way she tilted her head, glancing behind her like she knew someone was coming for her, was enough to confirm it. "She knows we're here." "Move," Marcus barked, picking up his pace. Rachel was right behind him. Veronica spotted them. Her head snapped in their direction. Her eyes locked on Rachel. For a heartbeat, time froze as they stared at each other from across the terminal. Then Veronica moved. "She's running?" Roberts yelled, shoving past a traveler with a suitcase. Rachel's heart jumped into her throat as Veronica shoved her way out of the line, darting toward the concourse. "Go, go, go," Marcus barked, breaking into a sprint. Rachel bolted after him, weaving between travelers, her backpack thumping against her back with every step. "Stop her." Roberts's voice boomed, echoing through the terminal. But Veronica didn't stop. Rachel's legs burned, her breath coming fast and shallow as she chased after Veronica. Her eyes locked on her target, the back of that black trench coat. Veronica shoved a man carrying a coffee, causing him to stumble and spill it all over himself. "Move," Rachel shouted as she leapt around the man, her focus locked on Veronica's retreating figure. Veronica glanced back, panic written all over her face. She veered left, ducking into a side hallway marked Gate C10-C19. Rachel was right behind her, her eyes locked on the black coat like a predator on prey. "Don't let her hit the gate," Marcus shouted from behind, his voice sharp and loud. Rachel's lungs burned, but she pushed harder, her feet slamming against the smooth tile. She darted around a woman dragging a suitcase, narrowly avoiding a collision. She's getting closer. Her eyes locked on the small bag Veronica clutched in her hand. "What's in the bag, Veronica? Plane ticket? Get evidence?" Her legs pumped harder. She wasn't letting her escape. The gates loomed ahead. An airline representative stood at the entry for gate CH19, scanning boarding passes. Rachel saw Veronica dig into her bag, pulling out a ticket. "No," Rachel shouted. Veronica whipped around, eyes wide with shock, and made a mad dash toward the gate agent. But Rachel was faster. She lunged forward, throwing all her weight into a desperate grab. Her fingers caught the edge of Veronica's coat and yanked hard. "Get off me!" Veronica shrieked, spinning and elbowing Rachel in the ribs. Pain shot through Rachel's side, but she didn't let go. Her grip tightened, yanking the coat with both hands. They hit the ground together in a tangle of arms and legs. Veronica kicked, clawing at Rachel's face, but Rachel pushed through the pain, pinning her down with a knee pressed to her back. "You're not going anywhere, Veronica," Rachel growled, gritting her teeth as Veronica thrashed beneath her. "Get off me!" Veronica screamed, her voice shrill and panicked. Detective Roberts was there in seconds, grabbing Veronica's arms and locking them behind her back. She kicked and flailed, but Roberts wasn't letting go. He yanked her to her feet, slapping cuffs on her wrists with a loud click. "You're under arrest," Roberts said, his voice calm and sharp. "Charges of fraud, embezzlement, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to commit theft. You have the right to remain silent. You don't know what you're doing," Veronica shrieked, her voice echoing through the terminal. "You'll regret this, all of you." Rachel stepped back, her chest heaving as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Her heart still pounded like a drum, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from satisfaction. Her eyes locked on Veronica as she was dragged toward the security office, her face twisted with rage and panic. Gone was the image of the poised, elegant woman. Gone was the superiority. All that remained was desperation. "You should have run faster, Veronica," Rachel muttered to herself, her eyes narrowing with resolve. Marcus approached, breathless but grinning. "Hell of a tackle, Carter." Rachel managed a small, tired grin. She was asking for it. Roberts approached, adjusting his jacket as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "Curtis is next," he said, his eyes sharp as ever. "Yeah," Rachel agreed, her gaze darkening. "Curtis is next." Her eyes lingered on the glass doors leading out to the runway. The sun was setting, casting streaks of orange and red across the sky. But her gaze didn't soften. Not this time. This wasn't over. Veronica was in custody, but Curtis was still out there. And he was worse. Marcus stepped beside her, his eyes following her gaze. "You ready for that one?" "More than ready," Rachel replied, her voice colder than it had ever been. "He's next. And this time I'm coming for him." Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, steady and certain. For the first time in a long time, Rachel didn't feel hunted. She felt like the hunter. And Curtis Reed was about to learn what that meant. The courtroom smelled of old wood and coffee. The scent hung in the air like an invisible fog, blending with the low murmurs of voices and the shuffle of papers. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting streaks of gold and shadow across the polished floors. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes flickered toward the judge, a woman with stern eyes and a sharp presence. On the other side of the room, Curtis sat with his lawyer, his jaw tight, his arms folded like a defiant child caught in a lie. The space between them felt like a chasm. Her heart pounded, but her face was still. She had practiced that calm, unreadable expression in front of a mirror. She wouldn't give Curtis the satisfaction of seeing her doubt or fear. She wouldn't give him anything. Next to her, Marcus leaned in. "You ready for this?" he asked in a low voice. Rachel glanced at him, her eyes hard as steel. "I've been ready." The bailiff called for order, and everyone rose as the judge took her seat. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, sharp and final. "Be seated," the judge said, her voice cutting through the low hum of whispers. Everyone sat. Rachel's heart thudded in time with the ticking of the courtroom clock. "This is the matter of Carter versus Reed," the judge announced, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk circling its prey. "The plaintiff, Rachel Carter, has presented documentation and supporting evidence to establish herself as the biological daughter of the late Gregory Reed. The defendants, Curtis and Veronica Reed, contest this claim on the grounds of alleged fraud and misrepresentation. Rachel glanced at Curtis, catching his cold glare. He didn't look away. He wants you to feel small, she reminded herself. Don't give him the chance. Mr. Chase, the judge said, turning to Curtis's lawyer. You may proceed with your final argument. Chase, a gray-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses, stood and buttoned his jacket. His voice was smooth, polished from years of courtroom battles. Your Honor, the defense asserts that Miss Carter's so-called evidence is unreliable at best and fraudulent at worst. While she claims to be the daughter of Mr. Reed, we have reason to believe these documents were manipulated after his death to position herself as an heir to his estate. The timing is suspicious to say the least. Rachel's jaw tightened, but she kept her face neutral. Let him talk, she told herself. It's all part of the show. Chase continued, gesturing toward Rachel's side of the room. The so-called birth certificate was conveniently discovered only after Mr. Reed's death. Why didn't she come forward before then? Why not when Mr. Reed was alive to confirm or deny her claim? The answer is simple, Your Honor, because she had no claim. This is an opportunist play, nothing more. He gave a small, smug smile as he sat down, smoothing his tie like he'd already won. Marcus glanced at Rachel, one brow raised. Not even creative, he muttered. This guy's been watching too many crime shows. Let it ride, Rachel whispered back. Miss Carter, the judge said, her eyes settling on Rachel. You may proceed. Rachel stood, feeling the weight of every set of eyes on her. The judge, Curtis, Chase, the courtroom spectators, they were all watching. Her throat felt tight for a second, but she drew a breath, letting her hands rest lightly on the table. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and clear. I'm not here to steal anything from anyone. I'm here to take back what's mine. Her gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Curtis before she returned her eyes to the judge. I didn't ask to be Gregory Reed's daughter, she said plainly. I didn't even know I was. For years, I lived my life thinking I was just a girl with a mom who worked too many shifts and never had time for me. I didn't know about the letters Gregory wrote to my mother. I didn't know he tried to see me. And I didn't know that he knew I existed. Her voice tightened, but she didn't let it break. I found the truth the hard way, she continued, nodding toward the metal box of evidence sitting on the table. These letters, these records, they don't lie. They tell the story of a man who made mistakes but tried to fix them. Gregory Reed tried to reach me. He couldn't, but he tried. And now that he's gone, all I have left of him is the truth he left behind. She took a breath, her eyes locking with the judge's. I'm not here to take anything that doesn't belong to me. I'm here to claim my place in my father's legacy. The room was silent. Not even Curtis dared to move. The judge tilted her head slightly, her eyes thoughtful. Thank you, Miss Carter. The court will now review the evidence and return a decision shortly. The gavel struck and everyone rose. Rachel exhaled slowly, the tension bleeding from her muscles like air from a balloon. She sat, staring at the tabletop, letting her heart slow down. You did good, Marcus said, nudging her shoulder. They felt that. 2 hours later, they were called back into the courtroom. Rachel's heart pounded with every step she took toward the plaintiff's table. She sat next to Marcus, her hands folded tightly, her breath slow but shallow. Curtis sat across from her, his jaw tight, eyes locked forward. No smirks. No glares. He knew what was coming. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and everyone sat. This court has reviewed the presented evidence, the judge said, her eyes scanning the room with slow precision. The plaintiff has presented irrefutable proof of her biological relationship with Gregory Reed, supported by official documentation, personal correspondence, and verified signatures. Her gaze settled on Curtis for a long, heavy pause. The claim of fraud, as argued by the defendants, is not supported by any credible evidence. Therefore, this court formally recognizes Rachel Carter as the legal daughter of Gregory Reed and a rightful heir to his estate. Rachel's heart swelled in her chest, a wave of emotion surging up so fast she thought she might cry. Her lips trembled, her hands covering her mouth as she blinked hard to hold it all in. Furthermore, the judge continued, the inheritance freeze imposed by the defendants is hereby lifted. Any remaining attempts to impede Miss Carter's access to her rightful inheritance will be met with contempt charges. Another bang of the gavel and it was over. Congratulations, Marcus said, nudging her with a grin. You did it, kid. But Rachel didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Her eyes shifted to Curtis, whose face was stone. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Curtis didn't respond. He turned slowly, locking eyes with Rachel for one long, sharp second. Then he left the room without a word. The next morning, Rachel stood in the middle of Gregory Reed's mansion. It was hers now. Every inch of it. Every polished floor, every wall lined with portraits, every rose in the garden. She should have felt victorious. She should have felt powerful. But instead she felt hollow. Her eyes drifted to the large family portrait hanging in the hallway. The one that had started everything. The one where her younger face stared back at her. Her fingers traced the edge of the frame. Her father's face was calm, strong, proud. She stared at it for a long time, wondering what it must have been like for him to see her grow up from a distance, never able to reach her. "I'm here now," she whispered. "I'm here." Her eyes flicked toward the hallway that led to the study. She thought about Curtis, Veronica, the betrayal, the lies. Her grip on the frame tightened. This house had been a battleground, but it could be something else. Later that day she called Marcus. "I have an idea," she said. "Yeah. What kind of idea?" "I want to turn the house into something more," she said, her voice clear, strong. "I want to make it a foundation. A place where people like me, people who've been called liars, thieves or frauds, can get the help they need." There was a pause on the other end. "Not bad, Carter," Marcus said with a grin in his voice. "Not bad at all." Rachel looked at the house one more time, her hands on her hips, her heart finally still. "It's mine now," she thought. "And I know exactly what to do with it." The front gates of the Reed estate creaked open, revealing a sight that Rachel had once never dreamed possible. The mansion, which once felt like a fortress of secrets, now had a completely new energy. Banners hung above the entryway with bold letters that read, "Welcome to the Montgomery Justice Foundation." It had taken 6 months, countless phone calls, dozens of contracts, and a level of patience she hadn't realized she had. But it was done. Her name was on it. Her vision had come to life. The house that had once symbolized greed and betrayal had been transformed into a beacon of hope. Rachel stood at the base of the front steps, hands on her hips, breathing in the fresh air. The front lawn, once silent and empty, was now filled with life. Families milled about on the path. Children tugged at their mothers' hands, their voices carrying the sound of hope rather than sorrow. Lawyers and paralegals moved through the front entrance, carrying briefcases and files, their faces focused but determined. People no longer whispered in the halls. They spoke freely. This wasn't Gregory Reed's house anymore. It was hers. Marcus walked up beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You know, I didn't think you'd actually pull this off," he said with a grin, handing her one of the cups. "Neither did I," Rachel admitted, taking the cup with a small smile. "But I guess I'm full of surprises." She sipped, the warmth of the coffee grounding her for a moment. Marcus tilted his head, glancing up at the banner. "The Montgomery Justice Foundation, huh? Not Carter? Not Reed?" Rachel shook her head. "No. Montgomery was my mother's maiden name," she said, her eyes thoughtful. "She might have made mistakes, but she fought for me in her own way. This is as much for her as it is for me." Marcus nodded, a slow, approving grin forming on his face. "Respect." They stood together for a moment, watching the movement of people coming and going. The house wasn't a prison anymore. It wasn't a battleground. It was hope. Rachel's journey was one of transformation, from a caretaker accused of murder to a woman who reclaimed her family legacy and used it to help others. But along the way she had to make tough choices, confront family betrayal, and face threats from people who wanted to erase her. What do you think about the choices Rachel made throughout the story? Would you have done the same in her situation, especially when Curtis threatened her? If Rachel's story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on the power of persistence, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of triumph, justice, and redemption. Your thoughts mean the world to us, and we'd love to hear from you.